Stuart Peck, Director of Cybersecurity Strategy for ZeroDayLab. Welcome to ZeroDayLive, where I'm joined today by Stu Hirst from PhotoBox, where we talked about DevSecOps, failing fast, bug bounty programs versus pen testing, and many related issues around human factors around security. So let's join him now, where we can kick off the conversation. So thank you for joining us, and of course, thank you, Stu Hirst, for joining us as well.
All right, it's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again. Before we go into the talk, we were both recently at Defcon. Just want to maybe just get your thoughts on how you found that this year.
Yeah, so my first time in Vegas, so really
Nice.
Interesting to see Vegas as a place, as a, you know, some of the craziness that goes on there. I'd heard a lot about it beforehand, so awesome that the company that I work for was kind of sponsored the opportunity to go out there, and had a few very busy days of kind of back-to-back meetings. Didn't get as much chance to see some of the conference side of things as I would have liked, but an extremely valuable few days out there. Met some great vendors, carried on some relationships I already have in the industry, hooked up with some great people, so really valuable week.
Excellent. I know what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what were the takeaways for you, really, from that event?
I think not only progressing relationships and some of the work that I'm already kicking off here, good to meet some of those people who are based out in the States, and just to see the scale of how those events are put on, not just Black Hat and Defcon, obviously you had kind of B-sides and various other initiatives going on. Great chance to network and meet some of the people that you know the names of, but never really put faces to names. So there was a lot of that kind of networking thing was really valuable for me. Defcon's an amazing spectacle just to walk around and see some of the crazy stuff that goes on. It's well beyond my level of knowledge, really, but yeah, really good fun. Yeah,
definitely a really good event, especially people dressing up in LED costumes and the craziness that goes on at Defcon. But yeah, definitely agree, it was a great event, and there was lots going on, which is almost too much in some respects. But yeah, definitely a good time for everyone I spoke to about it as well.
Indeed.
So for our viewers today, it'd be really useful if you could kind of give us a bit of a background around, well, your background, I guess, and how you got into InfoSec and maybe your journey about where you are today as well.
Sure. So this is actually my 20th year in IT.
Oh wow!
I did 12 years as a mainframe developer for my sins, I guess. It feels like such a lifetime ago. And then I joined the train line in 2011 as a tech analyst, which is where I was asked to do PCI compliance. So that was my first kind of tentative steps into InfoSec or some of the principles of InfoSec. Did 2 or 3 years there, and then I moved on to Skyscanner, which is really where I kind of did a huge amount of learning over those 3 years in a very agile tech business, which gave me a lot of freedom to upskill and drive some really important pieces of work there. Moved on from there to do 10 months at Capital One in their cyber leadership in the UK. And then got poached to come here at PhotoBox, which I have a little bit of history with. I nearly joined Moonpig 3 or 4 years ago, before Skyscanner. So great to be continuing the work that I love doing in kind of internet tech companies.
And so how does the work you've done from traditional kind of big corporates differ from some of the work you're doing within, say, those internet-focused businesses that have, you know, so much more sort of agile and flexible as organisations?
Yeah, and I think even that's changed over the last 6 or 7 years that I've been in the internet economy. When I think back to the train line in 2011, I mean, they called itself Agile, or they called it themselves Agile, but actually it wasn't particularly agile compared to what I now know, where we're pushing out code, you know, tens or hundreds of times a day potentially in these kind of companies. But if I think back to my time at RBS, where code releases would be once a month or once a quarter, they're very different environments. It makes security a challenge, I think, how you embed those principles or some of the principles we know to be true in those environments. It's been a steep learning curve for me, particularly in working in these places. This is my 7th or 8th year in security, so I'm by no means a veteran of the industry, but I thrive in these kind of environments of semi-chaos, I guess, where you've got freedom to experiment a little bit. You know, you're not necessarily defined by certain targets or KPIs that some of those bigger organisations might have. Okay. So there tends to be a little bit more freedom to try things out and fail fast. Terminology we use a lot in our day jobs these days.
So what are the challenges around Agile from a security perspective? So I spent a lot of time training developers on building security into Agile, and that's quite a new kind of concept, especially for the developers and especially for like the Scrum Masters and the product owners. But what do you find that your kind of challenges around kind of embedding security, which is typically seen as being, historically as a blocker, into those kind of very fast moving, like I said, releasing codes like sometimes 100 times a day. So how do you kind of build security into that process from what you do currently?
I think traditionally, again, I've only worked in fast-paced environments, but if from what I hear of slightly slower-paced organisations, security tends to say no to lots of things. It tends to be a bit of a blocker to pace and to agility. It comes with challenges trying to embed security into those environments. How do you put security controls in things that are changing so quickly all the time? How do we get our heads around the idea of constant change from a security point of view? That's certainly difficult. I think there's lots of great internet businesses that are trying to address some of those challenges. But it's certainly not without its moments of how do we take some of those traditional concepts of protecting architectures or networks or endpoints and bring them into those environments where things are changing all the time. A good example would be kind of code scanning, where if you're putting code out hundreds of times a day, you're not going to be able to implement some kind of tool that's going to slow that down, because you're not going to help that business drive change as quickly as it needs to. So how do you embed the right kind of tooling, the right kind of methodologies within that environment? I find it difficult, but I find it a great challenge to be in those organizations trying to fix those problems.
You mentioned something about fail fast as well, so I'd like to talk a bit about that. So because that's a methodology that some organizations may not embrace. So what is fail fast for you, and how does that benefit you as an organization, as a team, as an InfoSec professional?
I think the idea of failing fast is being able to be in an environment where you can try things out. If they don't work, you move on quickly to something else, and not be chastised for that as a failure. I understand in some more corporate machines potentially that that's more difficult to do. It's not potentially seen as a good thing to fail. I think the internet world is far more open to the idea of failing, learning, sharing that amongst your teams and amongst your business to try and make it better next time.
And how does that work in an environment where, for example, we talk about human error? So how does that used, so failing fast, obviously you're learning from those mistakes, how does that help mitigate some of the human error that kind of potentially an attacker could exploit, for example?
I think just those concepts of teaching other people about you failing at something. I think not just from an engineering point of view, but a business point of view, or even an industry point of view of what we deal with in security. Being able to stand up in front of people and say, this is what I tried, it didn't work, but this is what I then learned from that, and this is the knock-on effect of me then trying something different, allows people to share those experiences, understand why you tried to make certain decisions at certain times, and what the knock-on effect of that was. You tend to find in any business that the way that you learn, or the way that businesses get better, is incident response. Something bad happens, we retro why it went wrong, we put the fix in place, and we learn not to do those things again. So we talk about that kind of fail fast culture. It's not just the learning from the failure, it's having a culture where actually, to a certain extent, it's actually encouraged to fail, to as best, if that doesn't sound too alien, where the idea of trying something and failing but learning from it is actually more valuable than perhaps not doing that, because what you're not doing is you're not taking chances then, perhaps, because you may be in a culture that doesn't encourage that, or you get chastised for the failure.
So it's very much entrepreneurial environments, right? So
I think so.
So if you look at many entrepreneurs, they always talk about failing, right, and learning from failures, and actually you haven't been successful until you failed, right? So I guess what you're trying to say is that the fail fast kind of culture helps encourage creativity and people thinking necessarily outside the box, so to speak. I
think it encourages risk taking to a certain degree, and if I think back to some of the work that I've done in recent organisations, where because I didn't feel under pressure that absolutely everything had to be right or work first time or be embedded first time, allowed us an ability to try new things, and that wasn't just security; it was across the whole organisation. But doing those things quickly, and if they fail, you move on from it quickly. You learn quickly. You teach people about why it went wrong, and that encourages that risk-taking element. And I think that's why you see such hyper growth and movement in these kind of companies, and why it attracts certain types of. I think you're right. The entrepreneurial spirit amongst almost everybody in the business.
So that kind of almost goes against the grain of traditional security in some respects, because traditional security is all about risk management and understanding and mitigating, transferring, accepting risk, whereas fail fast is almost sort of encouraging risk, if that makes sense, or risk taking to some degree, right? So do you feel that that exposes the business to additional risk when you have that kind of very high kind of paced, fast-paced, agile environment, or do you think something different, maybe?
I think it can do. I think there's no doubt that by taking risks, you naturally introduce risk. Yeah. That is by its nature what happens. But if you look at traditional businesses that are locking everything down, that aren't moving with the times in terms of how security is moving on as an industry, well, they're getting hacked as well, right? So it's not as if their model is working any better than our model. Actually, when I look at the companies that are driving innovation in security, the companies that I look to for real kind of leadership and thought leadership in that space, it's all the internet economy businesses who are employing those things that we've just talked about, those methods, those experimentational cultures, where people don't necessarily know the right answer, but they're willing to try something and see what happens from it.
And who are those type of organisations that you look to currently, and what are the models that you like to sort of take from those organisations? That makes sense. For
me, I'm hugely vocal about Netflix. I think it's no secret that I've looked at them extensively over the last 4 or 5 years. Etsy was the first one where I sort of saw that DevSecOps thing. That was probably the first place that I'd heard that term. Noticed that they were trying to fix a lot of similar problems, or had already fixed similar problems that I found myself with at Skyscanner. How do you embed that security culture into not just DevOps, but a really fast-paced squads and tribes environment where 100 squads are existing autonomously. Okay. So that was one of the first companies I saw doing that. Had fixed some of those problems. I'm not suggesting for a moment that I came up with these ideas myself. This was based on research of other companies doing certain things. I think now Netflix have always been sort of top of the tree for me for just what they're open sourcing and the environment that they've got. I looked at Uber for a long time now. I know they've had their issues, I guess, in various parts of their business, but actually their security team has always been well revered in what they do and been ahead of the curve. Silicon Valley is obviously producing lots of these cool startups that are doing lots of good stuff. So that tends to be where I look. I mean, not exclusively internet economy, but that's where I'm getting a lot of my thoughts and ideas and potential avenues to look at new things from.
So how do you balance an agile model with compliance, for example? Because I know you'll be regulated by GDPR and PCI, amongst many other models, being an internet business, processing personal data and credit card information. So how do you balance that? Because I guess that must be quite challenging from very much a compliance focus, which you must do this, to very much an agile, let's develop something fast, efficient, be creative, fail fast, DevSecOps. How do you balance that? Because that must be, like I said, quite a challenge.
I think it is very difficult because some of those compliance frameworks, I guess, are not quick enough to go with that level of change. And I found PCI to be a particular pain in the backside sometimes, because some of those principles have moved on from a security aspect, yet PCI takes so long to update and for the council to introduce change that actually things have moved on beyond what the current kind of framework is. When I was at Capital One, that was a really interesting environment where they were doing things extremely agile for financial services, heavily cloud first, or all that great stuff. We actually heard that they were working closely with the regulators in the States to the point where they were actually informing the regulators of things that were forthcoming in the industry and things that the regulators should be taking on board. So it's actually business informing regulators rather than regulators forcing business to do a thing a certain way. So I think the two things have to work together. most people who see me on LinkedIn or Twitter know my views on compliance versus security. They're two different things, and one doesn't equal the other. I think it has a place, but I'm not the world's biggest compliance fan, shall we say, for that reason. No,
I have a statement I say quite a lot. The attackers don't care about compliance, right? No. You can be compliant as you like, and you can meet the standards, you can meet the requirements, but attackers always bypass that because they'll find loopholes and probably read the compliance statements and use that as a threat model to target you guys as well. So,
and I guess compliance helps mitigate some risk. It helps potentially help with fines or regulatory things that could come down the line from something bad happening. So it's covering yourself in certain areas. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't have a place. Things like GDPR have been extremely important for us to really improve how we protect customer data, and I think it's great that we're actually legally forcing companies to have to do that beyond what they'd been doing before, or they suffer the consequences for it. So it's not. I'm not entirely against the principles of compliance. I find that it's difficult to fit compliance frameworks into super agile companies.
No, I definitely agree, and I think if you take GDPR as a great example, I've seen in lots of organisations. Actually, I did some social engineering recently, and found that GDPR actually raised awareness to a level where when I was calling up these people trying to get their usernames and passwords, they were saying this is sensitive information, we can't disclose this, right? And so I think all the general awareness around GDPR and the levels of compliance and the training and the effort gone into the organisations has definitely had a massive benefit to sort of increasing the security baseline of organisations that didn't have it before. So most of the agree it's very important to have the regulators and the compliance standards and the frameworks that exist out there have definitely done a great job at raising the baseline. I guess to your point is they don't necessarily fit those organisations that are incredibly flexible. They're very much more tailored towards the larger organisations, the traditional kind of large, big banks, corporates, whatever it may be.
I guess for me it's been a little bit frustrating that I would like us to be able to change the culture of businesses from a security point of view without having to consider compliance.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree that actually compliance can help change those things, and it does get everybody talking about it, and it does get people concerned about it. I don't like having to feel that I'm forcing a business to have to do a certain thing because of a regulatory side of things. I'd like people to be bought into the security journey anyway, and then through the work that we do, it all starts to get driven from there. So I think there's pros and cons, more pros than cons to go. Anything that improves the security posture of a company can only be a good thing, but not if it's scaremongering people into ticking boxes or forcing them to do things because they feel that they'll suffer consequences, rather than actually it's just the right thing to do. And again, this is where that argument of compliance versus security is two different things.
Okay, so I've got a final point to raise. So we've been talking a little bit about the human factors around security, which all kind of ties back to the points just raised. How do you kind of currently deal with, obviously you talked about human error, but how do you deal with improving awareness around some of the kind of key threats around social engineering, human error, exploitation of people, people reusing passwords, the kind of common things we see that lead to most organisations being attacked, and in some cases errors in code and coding, which also lead to vulnerabilities and exploits and all these kind of great things. How are you kind of encouraging this through your fail first or the methodology you've adapted here to kind of reduce those kind of risks?
I don't think PhotoBox is any different from lots of other businesses doing similar things. So we have a security champions network here where we've had people who are interested in security or passionate about security in lots of different areas of the business are now working alongside us almost on a day-to-day basis to evangelize those things, to talk about those things, to bring up subject matter at their stand-ups or their all hands, and really just sharing lots of information over periods of time with those people.
Okay.
I think when you look at the size of security teams in these kind of organizations, we're not very big compared to the rest of the business. It's difficult for a small percentage of people to drive the kind of cultural change that we need quickly. So we really rely on people within those areas of the business to work alongside us and really push that message. we leverage all sorts of communication methods as lots of companies do, Slack and blog posts, and we're very vocal externally as well, which I love as well, and that's a big part of where I want to choose to be at a point in time, is how comfortable companies are with evangelizing their security and the journey they're on, because I think that's important from an industry point of view as well. Okay,
really good. And I think lots of really good points raised today, and I really appreciate your time. Before we go, is there anything else that you wanted to raise, or anything else you wanted to talk about from a PhotoBox security point of view that you want to talk to the community about right now?
I think for me, one of the major things that we're looking to invest in is AWS. I mean, we're in the top 3 data transfers of all time in AWS here, so just shifted 9.6 petabytes of data of photos into AWS. That's where we're at. We're cloud first, and we take that massively seriously. We're on a journey to try and recruit the right kind of people to do that. It's a passion of mine, AWS, alongside lots of other things in security. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, and we're looking to increase that kind of capability here. Okay, well, Stu, thank you very much for the time today. Thank you for sharing it with ZeroDayLive. And of course, hopefully we'll get to chat to you again in the future. But thank you very much. Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.